Hello again. I'm going to start with the CLE language, which will require eyeglasses. Make sure. Not exactly the hook, though, right? So here's our official language. This special Fireside chat has been approved to offer 0.5 New York State CLE credits in the category of areas of professional practice. If you're seeking CLE credit, don't forget to sign in and out of the CLE attendance sheet at the registration table, noting your time of arrival and departure. And we can't issue credit if you do not provide your signature on both your comings and your goings, or at least the start and the end of that. Thank you so much all again for what's been a really terrific day. And a big thank you to Lisa Monaco, our distinguished closing Fireside Chat speaker. Lisa, as you know from the materials and news media or anywhere else, is the president of global affairs of Microsoft, a former deputy attorney general of the United States and former White House Homeland Security advisor and deputy national security advisor on the National Security Council. I'm also delighted, for all of you who know or should know this, Lisa is a distinguished scholar in residence here at NYU School of Law. She previously taught a national security law and policy seminar, and last fall taught a seminar on the Department of Justice. So despite having a job that has her traveling the whole world, Lisa would often be seen in the halls of NYU making her way here as someone who has been a regular presence at NYU, including for mentoring our students and combining rigor with an uncanny ability to see what's coming next. In fact, Lisa and I first worked together when I was a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey and working on cyber and national security issues, and then got to meet her again, re-meet her here at NYU. So welcome and thank you for being here, Lisa.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, great to be part of this program. Judi does a wonderful job leading this program, and nice to see some familiar faces, former colleagues as well in the audience. So really happy to be here.
Thank you. So Lisa, you've really had a front row seat at Microsoft and also in the US government. How has the threat of deceptive AI, including deepfakes, evolved in your years?
Well, let me start by stepping back just for 1 second and give you a sense of, you've talked about my prior vantage point with my prior roles in government and national security and law enforcement. Let me just give you a bit of a sketch of what my current role is and how I have a vantage point on the issues from now the private sector side. So as Judi said, I lead global affairs at Microsoft. And in that role, the organization I lead is responsible for all engagements with global governments and international institutions, international organizations around the globe. And we bring together Microsoft's cybersecurity policy and national security expertise along with global engagement on a host of policy issues, including national security, cybersecurity, AI policy. And really the mission for the global affairs team at Microsoft is to earn and sustain the trust of customers, governments, and communities with whom we work. And fundamental to that is advocating for responsible deployment, development, use of AI. And so it is a fascinating vantage point now that I have. And one of the tools to give me these insights is a wonderful team that we have at Microsoft. Some of you may be familiar with it, the MTAC, Microsoft Threat Analysis Center. And this is a group of experts across Microsoft, including representing, I think, last count, a dozen different language expertise. And what they do is really work across the teams at Microsoft to detect, assess, and disrupt digital threats to our customers and governments with whom we work, including trying to stay ahead of the threat, including the threats of AI and deepfakes and the issues that we are seeing across AI and the use of deepfakes to really promote misinformation and to hinder trust across the ecosphere. So what that expertise enables me to see is a number of things that we've identified in a product that many of you may be familiar with. We do the Microsoft Digital Defense Report annually. We have to work on our branding. It's really catchily termed the MDDR. So we do need to work on that report title. But what we saw and what we've talked about in the most recent Digital Defense Report is some trends that we're seeing in terms of the threat of AI and deepfakes. And, you know, one thing I think is interesting that we've seen is the prototypical issue that you think about when you think about the harm from deepfakes is a really well-orchestrated and well-presented impersonation of a famous and really identifiable head of state. But frankly, what we're seeing is more impact from deepfakes and impersonations of lower-level officials being deployed often, and some of the most impactful deepfakes we've seen involve audio cloning, and this is something I know that the white paper you've released and talked about today has identified. So lower-level officials who are harder, it makes it harder to spot the fake element of it, and deploying this content in a particular context, right? Leaked, being portrayed as leaked or private discussions. And we've seen an example of this in Slovakia in the 2023 elections where we saw a journalist or purported conversation between a journalist and a candidate about election fraud. And it was released right during a 2-day blackout period under the Slovakian law. So the combination of a hard to detect, you know, not readily identifiable person, a lower level official, being leaked as a private conversation and being done in a very constrained window, which made it also hard to respond to. So all of those characteristics are the type of thing that we're seeing malicious actors really deploy to have maximum effect. And then, of course, and I'm sure you've talked about this across the day, not solely deepfakes, but the use of AI to really supercharge familiar cyber tactics, techniques, and procedures from phishing and fake credentials and the like.
During the day, Lisa, we've talked about measures including technological solutions, governance, and procedural solutions. In your view, what are, I should say, the most effective defensive measures?
So, you know, we talk about detection tools, right? And it's obviously important to constantly be refining those, but I don't think that is that's not going to be the be-all, end-all, right? We know that the technology and the models are moving so fast, it's really hard for the detection tools to always keep up. So, you know, the types of things, and this is what I think the private sector can do, is focus on, I would say, 2 things: resilience, and that has a few aspects to it. Partnerships across industry, with government, with NGOs, and we can talk a little bit about some of what we do in that space. But also, you know, pairing detection tools with, frankly, what I guess I call kind of civic awareness and education, right? Because it's getting at that ability to detect both technically, but also have folks have a kind of keener interpretive eye as they're engaging with this content. And we're all going to have to do better at that.
And that's a great point, and really a common thread through the day. You know, we've been talking about the importance of increasing awareness so people know to be skeptical, because it used to be, you know, as you know, as a prosecutor, you'd have a photograph and that was good evidence. You'd have an audio tape, that was really good evidence. You'd have a video, you know, great, case closed, except not so much anymore.
Not so much, and now you're taking me back to my days as a prosecutor when I literally had to bring in the little videotape recorder and press play. Those days are gone. Yeah, thank you for the laugh out there, someone who's as old as I am.
If we could talk for a moment about national security. How are nation-state adversaries using deepfake threats against us?
Well, first, what we are seeing is a real acceleration in adoption of AI in the influence operations. And this is really the core specialty of MTAC, the group of experts, and the tremendous kind of crown jewel asset that we have at Microsoft. So rapid adoption, and we've really seen, actually, and we documented this in the MDDR, a real acceleration in the use of AI in influence operations, particularly over the last 6 months of 2025 that we documented in this report. But I would say 3 trends that I would call out when it comes to nation states deploying AI in fraudulent ways. I would say twinning, right? This is a practice that we have seen of the kind of impersonation of trusted news anchors in international context who are out there kind of deploying and promoting state-backed narratives, right? Another trend we've seen documented in the MDDR is the kind of poisoning of data, and that obviously is going to impact the ability of models to deploy and deal with trusted content. And those are features that I think have been, I think, the very prominent tactics that we've seen from nation states.
Are we concerned also about destabilizing elections and financial markets with regard to deepfakes?
Oh, sure. Obviously the election context is something that we have been very, very focused on from what do we call it, the year of the election in 2024, right? More democracies went to the polls than any other time, I think, in history. And Microsoft teamed up with a number of over a dozen other companies in 2024 to come together on a set of principles and practices to combat the use of deceptive use of AI in relation to elections. So those types of kind of alliances or trying to galvanize best practices is something we've tried to deploy with a number of other companies to respond to exactly that type of potential destabilizing efforts. And you and I were just talking in the green room about some of what we've seen and what you've documented in the white paper that you released in connection with this gathering. The shocking number of times that I have seen, both in my prior role as Deputy Attorney General and since, the number of really kind of blue chip companies that find themselves really caught up short with a deepfake deployment, either video or more often in audio cloning, that really finds its way into a compliance infrastructure, but for kind of a human saying, well, wait a minute, really? The CEO's calling me to release those funds? And it really becomes, and we talked about this, more a question not just of technological or systemic or compliance systems being able to kick in. It's a cultural issue, right? You got to make sure that the CEO and the C-suite is sending the message really deep into the control side of the business that, they really should be questioning. If it doesn't feel right, they shouldn't be reacting with that urgency, because as we know, and as you've documented, that it is playing upon this kind of sense of urgency that is what the malicious actors are really trying to capitalize on.
And I think for a lot of business leaders, there is a lot of photographic and video and audio evidence out there that can be used to create deepfakes. And so it is very much a culture issue to make sure people are aware of the threat and comfortable enough saying, with all due respect, that you're the boss of the company telling me to do this. How do I know it's you?
Yep.
When I came to NYU in 2013 as a fellow, my first project was on public-private partnerships, and just to carry the alliteration, I published a paper on public-private partnerships. But when we talk about deepfakes and malicious use of synthetic media, how do public-private partnerships play a part? Please.
So I think there's a number of things to explore there, and it can take many different forms. So I talked about the tech accord that Microsoft was proud to join hands with a number of other companies in 2024. So it can take the form of these kind of alliances, and the classic situation where if government isn't stepping up to the plate and isn't galvanizing around clear frameworks, then I do think, and this is something that it's one of the reasons I came to Microsoft, because it does have this attitude that we don't need a law to tell us what the right thing to do is. We should be leading and coming together with others across industry to exemplify and lead best practices, and that's what we did with the Tech Accord to really try and galvanize best practices around watermarking and content provenance practices. Is why we're happy to and really pleased to be able to join hands and co-launch the C2PA to just continue with the acronyms. So, alliances and trying to lead and galvanize around best practices, that's one way that I think the private sector can demonstrate leadership and really kind of set the right tone. But when it comes to joining public and private partnerships, I think there is setting the tone and trying to advocate for where we think the regulatory and legislative framework should go. We have long now advocated for a number of legislative and regulatory frameworks to include driving towards requiring provenance labels, right? Making explicit in CSAM statutes and non-consensual intimate imagery statutes that, yes, it applies to AI-generated content. I was very pleased that when I was Deputy Attorney General, the Justice Department brought the first ever criminal prosecution for completely AI-generated CSAM content, right? The statute wasn't explicit on this point, but we thought it was covered, and so we made the argument to do exactly that. But we should remove all doubt and put that in the statutes, right? There ought to be a deepfake fraud federal framework, right? So that law enforcement has a clear kind of roadmap for that. So these are the types of things like we should be advocating as industry for where we think the framework should go. And then we can be working also with non-governmental organizations. We're doing a lot of work with a human rights organization called Witness, right, which has tremendous expertise in the use of and abuse of AI technology, including deepfakes, in conflict scenarios, right? So these types of partnerships are where I think we can be really lending our technical expertise, our voice and our advocacy to really drive both the regulatory process and industry to be lining up in one way.
And those are great points in terms of some of the regulatory progress that should be made. In addition to what you've mentioned, are there other ways that we can help drive right-sized, appropriate regulation?
Well, it's interesting. When I was in government, I used to say, and I still think it's true, we shouldn't ignore, even though I think technology will always be ahead of the law. That just is a fact, and that's, the technology innovation is moving so fast, and the legislatures don't keep up, but that shouldn't stop enforcement efforts, right? I used to say, just because AI is enabling discrimination, it's still discrimination, right? Harassment enabled by AI is still harassment, right? We have legal frameworks that law enforcement can use, but that doesn't stop us from advocating for making those frameworks more precise and more explicit. You know, some other things that we're doing with across industry and with NGOs is, you know, contributing to data sets that can help algorithms recognize deepfakes and fraudulent material produced with AI. So we've done the deepfake benchmark data set that helps algorithms understand and see and train on and discern deepfakes from you know, real content. So these are the types of things that I think we as industry can lend our expertise to.
On the tech side, Lisa, do you think we can have hope in detection technologies, or has that battle come and gone? And are we in a world where we can't trust what we see, or do you have some words of optimism for us?
Well, I think we should, we've got to be optimistic, because if we just throw up our hands and say, all right, we'll never be able to discern what's true and what's not, I mean, that is not a place for democracy to be. And so we can't throw up our hands. You know, by the same token, detection tools aren't going to do it, and for all the reasons we've already talked about. They are a necessary but not sufficient, I would say, aspect to all this. We've got to kind of raise our game when it comes to AI literacy and the ability of people to be more discerning consumers, right? So, you know, we do a bunch of work with a host of different organizations, from, you know, public libraries that can scale understanding about AI and how to be a more informed consumer, to working with the AARP. We know that older adults are really the kind of prime target for fraud schemes and the like. And so we're doing work with the AARP to do more kind of scam awareness training. So just enabling people to both have the tools, technical and otherwise, to be better and more informed consumers and more discerning consumers of content.
And in this battle, what would you say are the most impactful things that Microsoft is doing to address deepfake risk?
So I think it's a combination of kind of technical tooling and advocating for common standards, right? I think that is really, really important. So things like the C2PA and the fact that we are using that ourselves to really integrate content credentials across the generative AI services that we deploy, right? So if we can drive more platforms, more providers, more companies to do exactly that, that ought to be a baseline. Again, it's not going to be the whole solution, but it's got to be something that we drive to at least a baseline to. And then, as I said, the types of partnerships that we have engaged with, from governments to NGOs, that has to be a combination approach.
I'm going to go back to something rather scary that you said earlier. Okay. We've been talking about concerns of deepfakes in manipulating people's perspectives, including what we see in media may be true or not true. And one of the examples was, well, then rely, or something that is sometimes comes up is, well, then rely on trusted media outlets. But what you said earlier is that we're seeing deepfakes of trusted, vetted media people who are then saying things, or who are then deepfaked. How do we address that kind of threat? And what does that mean for business and democracy and everything else?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously that's the kind of thing that can be quite destabilizing. I think what we shouldn't do is look for single providers to be the arbiters of what is true and what is not, right? We have to have space for and make sure that we are maintaining space for free expression, but incorporating and driving a process where you're seeing more content credentialing across platforms, across providers. Because if we leave it to particular organizations or particular businesses to be the arbiters of what is fake and what's not, I think you both will not have maximum effect, and you can find yourself in a world where though you're not always going to be the most trusted arbiter of that or purveyor of those of what is true and what is not. So having a really shared standard that is adopted kind of far and wide when it comes to content provenance and content credentialing, I think, is where we've got to drive to.
Final question.
Okay.
If you could implement one global rule or standard to address the harm from deepfakes or malicious use of deepfakes, what would it be?
So I do think it is a shared standard like the C2PA, and thank you for calling it out in the white paper that you published. A shared standard for kind of content credentialing and content provenance that gets adopted widely would I think, do a great service to these efforts. But at the end of the day, again, I think I really want to stress that detection alone or verification or identification isn't solely going to do it, right? We need to have, give people the tools to consume this information and to identify and find their way to trusted content. But at the end of the day, and the focus here is rightly on democracy and what does the kind of pervasive or increasingly pervasive use of deepfakes, what does that mean for democracy? If democracy is ultimately about debate, which I do believe it is, the most critical aspect to a healthy debate is having evidence that you can trust for the elements of that debate to be hashed out, right? So democracy, debate, and trusted evidence are the key elements here to a healthy democracy. And it's going to take more than simply detection tools. You're going to need civic education and discerning kind of consumers of that information as well.
I always come away from our conversations far more enlightened. So thank you so much, Lisa, for
Thanks for
sharing your
having me.
time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.